there is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one. You wake up in the morning and for a single moment, before the day lands on you, you feel almost fine. And then it returns. The weight of everything unfinished. The conversation that went wrong and still lives in your chest. The version of your life that you imagined you would be living by now, sitting just out of reach like a promise that keeps being quietly revised. You go through the motions. You respond to messages. You say the right things to the right people. But underneath all of it, there is this persistent, low hum of something that does not have a clean name. It is not quite sadness. It is not quite anxiety. It is more like the feeling of being slightly out of sync with your own life, present in body somewhere else in mind, watching yourself move through days that feel like they're happening to you rather than being lived by you. If you know that feeling, then you already know why you are here, and it is the kind of feeling that sits at the very heart of what the Stoic path was built to explore, not to explain away, not to fix with a list of tips, but to look at honestly, the way an old friend might look at you across a table and say, I know, I have been there too, and I found something that helped. What is strange, genuinely strange, in a way that should stop you for a moment, is that the person who understood this feeling most completely lived nearly 2,000 years ago. He had no social media, no inbox, no performance reviews, no mortgage, no late-night phone in his hand scrolling through the lives of people he barely knew, feeling the particular shame of comparison. And yet if you read what he wrote, not what was written about him, but what he wrote to himself privately with no intention of being read, you will find described with almost frightening precision the interior of a mind that sounds unmistakably modern, unmistakably like yours. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and before you hear his philosophy, before you hear what he believed or what he practiced or what he would say to you right now, you need to hear something about his actual life, not the statues, not the title, not the historical footnotes that reduce him to an emperor and a philosopher, as though those two words can capture what it actually cost a person to be him. He was born in the year 121 in Rome, and his father died when he was 3 years old. 3 years old, before language had fully formed. Before memory was reliable, he lost the person who was supposed to show him what a man was, what strength looked like, how to move through a world that was indifferent to your suffering. He grew up in the house of his grandfather, and by all accounts he was a serious child. Not sad exactly, but already inclined toward interiority, already watching the world from a slight distance, already asking the kinds of questions that made adults pause. When he was around 17, the Emperor Hadrian noticed him, not because he was performing, not because he was angling for attention. Hadrian noticed him because there was something in the boy that was difficult to manufacture, a quality of genuine thought, of real presence, of a mind that seemed to be actually engaged with reality rather than skating across its surface. Hadrian gave him a new name, made him a candidate for the future, and from that moment, Marcus Aurelius was no longer simply a young man trying to find his way. He was a young man being prepared for something enormous, something he had not asked for and could not refuse. By the time he was actually emperor, he was 40 years old, and the empire he inherited was already cracking. There was plague, the Antonine Plague, which would eventually kill somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman world. There were wars on the northern border, constant and brutal and expensive in every sense of the word. There was betrayal from men he had trusted. There were colleagues who turned against him. There were decisions that had to be made in real time, with incomplete information affecting millions of lives, with no guarantee that any choice was correct. He was required to command armies in the field while his body was failing him. He suffered from chronic illness, likely a condition affecting his chest, possibly what we would now call an ulcer or something similar. And the record suggests that he was in physical pain for much of his adult life. He had 13 children with his wife Faustina. 9 of them died. Read that again. 9 of 13 children died before he did. He buried children. He sat with that grief over and over, and then got up and went back to governing the known world. He had reason, more than most people in history have ever had reason to break, to become bitter, to use his power as a kind of anesthetic, to stop caring because caring had cost him so much. He did not do any of those things, and the reason he did not, the thing that kept him, by his own account, from either tyranny or collapse, was something he wrote to himself. Not for us, for himself. Small notes, private reminders, the kind of thing a person writes when they are trying to hold themselves together with the force of honest thought. We call it meditations today. He called it nothing because he never intended it to be called anything. It was a man talking to himself in the dark, reminding himself of what he actually believed, practicing on paper the person he was trying to become, and what he was trying to remind himself of over and over in different words from different angles, with what reads at times like genuine desperation, was a single idea so simple it sounds almost obvious when you first encounter it. So simple, in fact, that most people hear it and move past it, without realizing they have just walked past the most useful thing they will ever encounter. The idea is this: you do not control what happens, you only control how you respond. There it is. You have probably heard some version of this. You may have nodded at it on a poster. You may have found it in a self-help book or a therapist's office or a motivational account somewhere online. And because you have heard it before, some part of your mind has already categorized it as known, filed it under things I understand, and moved on. But here is what Marcus Aurelius actually meant by it, which is something considerably more radical than the bumper sticker version, and something that will take a moment to land properly. He did not mean try to stay calm when bad things happen. He did not mean look on the bright side. He did not mean control your emotions. He meant something structural, something about the actual architecture of reality and your relationship to it. He meant that there is a line, a real identifiable line between the part of existence that belongs to you and the part that does not. And most human suffering, he believed, comes not from what falls on the wrong side of that line, but from our refusal to acknowledge where the line actually is. The Stoics had a word for this: hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the part of you that decides what things mean, not what happens, what things mean. Because the same event, a public failure, a rejection, a loss, a diagnosis, an insult, does not mean the same thing to every person who experiences it. It cannot. Because meaning is not contained in the event. It is added by the mind that encounters the event. And the mind, Marcus believed, can be trained. Slowly, imperfectly, with backsliding and frustration, the mind can be trained to add different meaning. Not false meaning, not forced positivity, accurate meaning. Meaning that reflects what is actually true rather than what fear or ego or habit insists is true. This is the distinction that changes everything, and it is worth slowing down for. When something painful happens to you, say you were passed over for a promotion that you deserved, or someone you loved ends things without adequate explanation, or you look at the arc of your life and feel a sudden, vertiginous sense that time is passing and you are not becoming the person you intended to be. There are two things happening simultaneously. There is the event itself, which is real and has weight and deserves acknowledgement. And then there is the interpretation you add to the event, the story you build around it, the meaning you assign, the implications you project forward into your future. And that second thing, the interpretation, is where most of the suffering actually lives. Marcus wrote, "The things themselves do not touch the soul. They stand outside it, and our disturbance comes from the opinion we form within." He wrote this to himself. He wrote it because he needed to remember it. He wrote it because he was in pain, and the pain was making him want to interpret events in ways that would justify bitterness or despair. And he needed to catch himself before he did. Notice what he is not saying. He is not saying the pain is not real. He is not saying the event does not matter. He is not counseling numbness or detachment or the performance of contentment. He is saying something much more precise. The event is one thing, and what you make of the event is another thing, and you have more control over the second than you think. Modern psychology. which arrived at its conclusions through clinical research, through therapy outcomes, through cognitive neuroscience. Through decades of work with actual patients experiencing actual suffering, discovered something that runs almost precisely parallel to what Marcus was writing in a tent on the Danube frontier 2,000 years ago. They called it cognitive reappraisal, the capacity to consciously examine and deliberately revise the meaning we assign to events. And the research on this is remarkable. Studies using functional MRI scanning have shown that when a person consciously reappraises a distressing event, not suppresses their feelings, not pretends nothing happened, but genuinely re-examines the meaning they have attached to it, the activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, measurably decreases. The nervous system actually calms, not because the event changed, because the interpretation changed. Marcus Aurelius had no fMRI machine. He had no clinical trials. He had a tent and a candle and a pen and a mind that was brilliant and suffering and honest enough to write down what it actually found when it looked inward. And what it found matches, with uncanny precision, what the best science of the human mind has confirmed in the last 30 years. This is not a coincidence. This is what happens when someone looks at human experience with enough honesty and enough patience. The same territory appears. The same structures of suffering emerge. The same possibilities for freedom become visible. Now here's where it becomes personal. Not philosophical personal, but the kind of personal where you recognize your own life in the description. Think about the last time something happened at work that humiliated you. Maybe you made a mistake in front of people whose respect you value. Maybe you were spoken to in a way that was dismissive or unfair. Maybe you suggested something in a meeting and it was ignored or mocked, and you sat there with your face arranged into a professional expression while something inside you went very quiet and very cold. And then you drove home, or you sat at your desk for the rest of the day, or you lay in bed that night, and the event replayed. Not once, many times. And each time it replayed, something in the narration grew. The implications expanded. I am not respected. I will never be respected here. I have chosen the wrong place. I am not as capable as I thought. I will feel this way forever. That expansion, that is not the event. The event was 30 seconds of discomfort in a conference room. The expansion is what your mind added, and most of the suffering that followed, the hours of rumination, the erosion of confidence, the low-grade misery that colored everything for days, most of that came from the expansion, not the event. A person who has understood what Marcus understood does not pretend the moment did not sting. It stung. The sting is real, and it is information. It tells you something about what you value, about where you are vulnerable, about what you might want to address or change. The sting is useful, but the expansion is optional. The hours of replaying a 30-second moment as though it contains your entire future. That is optional. And the recognition that it is optional is not a small thing. It is one of the most genuinely liberating things a person can discover about the structure of their own mind. Or consider this, the relationship that costs you more than it gives. You know the one. Maybe it is still happening. Maybe it ended and you are still sorting through the wreckage. There is a particular quality to the exhaustion that comes from a relationship that is fundamentally draining. A friendship that always seems to leave you feeling slightly diminished. A romantic partnership where you have given so much of yourself that you are not entirely sure what is left. A family dynamic that activates something old and painful every single time. And you have probably spent a significant amount of time trying to fix it, trying to understand it, trying to be better, trying to make them understand, trying to find the version of events where everyone comes out okay. Marcus understood this too. He wrote about it repeatedly because he lived it repeatedly. He was surrounded by people who disappointed him. He had advisors who were self-serving. He had a son, Commodus, whom history remembers as one of Rome's worst emperors, who inherited the throne and squandered everything his father had built. Marcus watched his own son become a person he could not reach, could not fix, could not save. And he had to find a way to continue functioning, continue ruling, continue being the person his empire needed him to be, while carrying that grief. What he arrived at was not coldness. It was not the severing of care. It was something harder and more honest. The recognition that other people's choices, other people's nature, other people's growth or failure to grow, these are not yours to control. They are, in the language of the Stoics, outside the circle of your will. And the suffering that comes from treating external things as though they are internal, treating other people's behavior as something you should be able to determine, is suffering that serves no one and costs everything. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This is not indifference. This is not the advice to stop caring about people. It is the advice to care about them without making your peace contingent on their choices. It is the recognition that you can love someone completely and still acknowledge that you cannot live their life for them, that you can be genuinely invested in a relationship and still recognize that your own stability cannot depend on whether the other person changes in the ways you need them to change. This is one of the most difficult things Marcus ever wrote, and one of the most useful, and it will take most people years to actually practice rather than merely understand. If you have found yourself sitting with these ideas, pausing, feeling something shift, recognizing yourself in the description, that feeling is exactly why the Stoic path exists. Not to deliver information, but to create the kind of encounter where ancient thought meets your actual life and something real happens in the space between them. If you subscribe, this conversation continues for you every time a new video arrives. You will not be subscribing to content. You will be subscribing to a practice of honest reflection, and that is a different thing entirely. Because there is another territory where this teaching cuts deepest, and it is the one that most people are least willing to look at directly. It is grief. Not the grief of a specific loss, though that is real and we will get to it, but the broader grief of the life you expected to be living by now, the version of yourself that was supposed to have arrived, the relationship that was supposed to have lasted, the career that was supposed to have taken off, the confidence that was supposed to have come with age. Most people carry this grief quietly, without naming it grief, because it does not look like grief. It looks like dissatisfaction, or restlessness, or a vague sense that something is missing. But it has the same structure. It is the loss of something. And like all losses, it demands to be acknowledged before it can be moved through. Marcus lost children. He lost friends. He lost his health incrementally, year by year, even as the demands on him increased. And he grieved. He did not perform stoic indifference. He felt what he felt. But he also, and this is the crucial part, he also recognized the difference between grief and the stories he told himself about grief. The difference between feeling the loss and building an identity around it. The difference between sitting with pain long enough to understand what it is telling you and making a permanent home in it because at least it is familiar. There's a line in Meditations that stops many people cold when they encounter it. Marcus writes, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." Read that without the philosophical distance. Read it as a man who just buried another child. Read it as a man sitting in a tent far from home, in physical pain, governing a dying empire, writing to himself in the dark. Loss is nothing else but change. He is not dismissing the loss. He is placing it in the only frame large enough to hold it honestly. The frame of nature of time, of the fact that everything that exists within a process of constant transformation, and that the suffering we feel when things change is partly the pain of the change itself, and partly our insistence that the change should not be happening. The pain of the change is unavoidable. The insistence is optional. This matters enormously when we talk about the fear of the future, which is, for most people alive right now, the sharpest and most persistent form of suffering. The fear that arrives at night, that wakes you at 3 in the morning with a specific, vivid image of something going wrong. The job that might not last. The relationship that might not survive. The health of someone you love. The direction of a world that feels increasingly difficult to trust. The fear is not irrational. The things you fear are real possibilities. But fear, when it becomes chronic, when it becomes not a signal but a constant background condition, is doing something very specific inside you. It is not protecting you. It is consuming the present in order to prepare for a future that may never arrive. Marcus wrote, "Do not indulge in thinking over all the various things which have happened in the past or will come to pass in the future, but confine yourself always to the present." This is often misread as advice to ignore the future, which is not what he meant. He was a military strategist. He planned, he prepared, he built contingencies. What he meant was something more interior. Do not allow the mind to colonize the present with the suffering of imagined futures. Plan in the present, prepare in the present, and then return to the present rather than living permanently in a future that is by definition a construction of your mind and not yet real. What neuroscience has to say about this is both confirming and humbling. The default mode network, the brain system that activates when you are not focused on an external task, when your mind is wandering, is, in most people, predominantly oriented toward the future and the past, toward worry and rumination. This is evolutionary. It was adaptive for a mind to run threat simulations, to replay failures in order to avoid repeating them, to project forward and imagine dangers. But the modern human mind runs this system almost constantly, even when the threats are not physical, even when the simulations are not serving any protective function, even when the rumination is simply making things worse. The Stoics did not have a name for the default mode network, but they had a practice for it. They called it prosoche, attention, the deliberate, continuous practice of noticing where the mind has gone and bringing it back to what is actually happening right now. Which brings us to the practice, the one specific concrete thing that Marcus Aurelius did every single morning, the thing that is documented in his own writing, the thing that is simple enough to begin tomorrow and significant enough to change the quality of every day you practice it. He called it the morning preparation, and it is this. Before the day begins, before you check your phone, before the obligations and frictions of daily life arrive, you sit for 5 minutes. Not in meditation, not in silence necessarily, just in deliberate thought. And you ask yourself one question. What difficulties am I likely to encounter today, and how do I want to respond to them? That is all. But notice what it is actually doing. It is not positive visualization. It is not the pretense that the day will go perfectly. It is the explicit acknowledgement that the day will contain friction, that someone will probably say something that lands badly, that something will not go as planned, that there will be moments of frustration or irritation or disappointment. And then, before those moments arrive, you are deciding in advance who you want to be inside them, not what you want to feel. Who you want to be. Marcus wrote about this practice in terms of what he called the 3 disciplines. The discipline of perception, seeing things as they actually are, not as fear or ego insists they are. The discipline of action, doing what needs to be done, with attention to what you can actually influence without grasping at what you cannot. And the discipline of will, accepting what cannot be changed without bitterness, without the kind of resistance that costs more than it saves. 5 minutes in the morning to name what is coming. 5 minutes to decide, ahead of time, which of the 3 disciplines you will call upon when the predictable difficulties arrive. The neuroscience behind why this works is elegant and not complicated. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for deliberate, rational decision-making, is significantly less active when you are in the middle of an emotional response. When you feel threatened, embarrassed, or afraid, the older, faster parts of the brain are running the show, and the prefrontal cortex is essentially waiting for the storm to pass before it can contribute anything useful. But if you have already, in a calm moment, made a decision about how you want to respond, if the decision has already been made when the cortex was fully online, then when the moment arrives, the response requires less cognitive effort. It is already there, pre-decided. The calm version of you has already spoken, and the disrupted version of you has somewhere to return to. Marcus did this for decades. He was not always successful. The meditations are full of evidence that he struggled, that he backslid, that he had to remind himself of the same things repeatedly because he kept forgetting them under pressure. There are passages where he sounds almost impatient with himself, telling himself to stop complaining, to stop indulging in self-pity, to return to what he actually believes. He was not a saint. He was not an enlightened being who had transcended the ordinary difficulties of being human. He was a man with exceptional responsibilities and very ordinary internal weather, trying to bring what he believed into alignment with how he actually lived. And the honest, unglamorous, daily trying, is exactly what makes him worth listening to. Here's something most people do not know about Marcus Aurelius, and it shifts something in the way you read his writing once you learn it. The meditations were not written in Rome. They were not written in a palace or a library, or any place of comfort or ease. The majority of them were written during the Marcomannic Wars, Marcus Aurelius's military campaigns on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire, along the Danube River in what is now Austria and Hungary. He wrote them in military camps, in tents, during a campaign that lasted over a decade, during a plague that was killing soldiers and civilians alike, during a period when he was personally commanding military operations despite chronic illness that should, by any reasonable standard, have sent him home. He was writing philosophy from inside the worst thing he had ever experienced, not reflecting on difficulty from a safe distance, not offering wisdom from the comfort of hindsight. He was in the middle of it, and he was trying to think clearly anyway, and the trying was the whole point. He was not writing toward a finished version of himself. He was writing as a practice of becoming, as a daily act of refusing to be defined by the conditions he was living through. There is something almost unbearably instructive about this when you place it next to your own life. You are not on a military frontier. You are not commanding armies while your body fails and your children die, and the empire you are responsible for continues its slow unraveling. But you are in the middle of something. You are not at a safe distance from your own difficulties. You are inside them, the way he was inside his. And the question his writing forces you to sit with is this: what does it mean to think clearly from inside difficulty? Not after it. Not once it has resolved. Inside it, while it is still happening, because that is where most of the important choices are made. Not in calm moments of reflection, but in the actual moment of pressure, when the old habits are pulling hard and the new understanding is still new and untested. The clarity you cultivate in the 5 quiet minutes of morning is the clarity you draw on at 11 o'clock when the meeting turns hostile, or at midnight when the anxiety arrives, or in the conversation with the person you love that keeps going in the same direction it has always gone, no matter how careful you prepared. Marcus wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." These are among the most quoted words in the entire Stoic canon, and they are worth considering not as inspiration, but as genuine philosophical claim. He is not saying that adversity builds character in some vague, motivational sense. He is saying something structural. The resistance you encounter is not separate from the path. It is the path. The difficulty is not a detour. It is the terrain. And a person who understands this does not become superhuman in the face of obstacles. They simply stop treating obstacles as evidence that something has gone wrong with their life. Because nothing has gone wrong. The obstacles are what the life is made of. The practice happens inside them, not around them. Think about what this means for the fear of failure. Most people have a deep, rarely examined belief that failure is the interruption of a life that was supposed to be going smoothly. That if things were working the way they were supposed to work, there would not be setbacks. There would not be rejection, or false starts, or years that fell wasted, or versions of yourself you had to abandon because they turned out not to be who you actually are. The failure is treated as the aberration, the evidence that something went wrong. And because it is treated that way, it arrives with shame. The particular shame that comes from believing that other people are not experiencing what you are experiencing. That everyone else is somehow navigating a smoother version of the same road. Marcus Aurelius had every earthly advantage and still suffered in ways that should make your own suffering feel less like personal failure and more like simple participation in the human condition. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he buried 9 children. He had the resources of an empire, and he could not stop a plague. He raised a son with every advantage, and the son became someone history remembers with shame, Power does not protect you from the things that make life genuinely difficult. It never has. The difficult things are not distributed according to merit or effort or intelligence or position. They are distributed the way weather is distributed, without preference, without fairness, without any message about your value or your worthiness. This understanding that suffering is not evidence of your failure, that difficulty is not punishment, is one of the most quietly radical things you can absorb from Stoic thought, because once you genuinely believe it, the shame lifts. Not all of it, and not immediately, but the particular layer of suffering that comes from the belief that you alone are struggling, that everyone else has figured something out that you have missed, that layer begins to dissolve. And what is left underneath is something cleaner and more workable. Just the difficulty itself. Just the thing you are actually dealing with, without the additional weight of believing it is your fault that you are dealing with it. Marcus wrote about this in terms of what he called the universal nature. The idea that you are not a solitary node of experience floating in isolation, but a part of something continuous, a fabric of cause and effect of nature and time. That was happening long before you arrived and will continue long after you leave. This is not mysticism. It is an invitation to a certain kind of proportion. When the thing that is tormenting you right now is placed inside that scale, inside the actual scale of what existence is, how long it has been going, how much has already been suffered and survived by people who felt exactly what you feel. Something in the torment changes, not because the problem became smaller, because your understanding of where you actually are became larger. He wrote, "You have been made from the world and you will return to it. Everything between is a kind of gift. Even the difficult things, even the grief, even the waiting. There is a kind of peace in that, if you will let it be peace rather than dismissal. If you will hear it as an invitation rather than an instruction to stop feeling what you feel." And this is where Marcus ultimately becomes not just a philosopher, but something more specific and more useful. A companion for the specific kind of loneliness that comes from taking your own life seriously. The loneliness of being a person who actually thinks about things, who actually tries to live with some integrity, who finds that the trying is hard and the failing is frequent, and the gap between who you intend to be and who you actually are in the difficult moment keeps appearing no matter how much work you do. He was lonely in this way, genuinely lonely. He wrote to himself because there was no one else he could speak to with complete honesty. He was emperor. He was surrounded by people who needed things from him, who performed loyalty, who filtered what they said through their own interests and fears. He had to be a certain thing for everyone around him all the time. And the space for genuine reflection was whatever he could carve out in the private hours before dawn, in the marginal spaces of a life that was never entirely his own. And yet in that loneliness, he found something that was not lonely at all. He found that when he looked honestly at his own experience, when he stopped performing and simply reported what he actually found inside himself, he was not describing something private and idiosyncratic. He was describing something universal: the fear, the anger that wanted to become cruelty, the grief, the longing for things to be different than they were, the desire for recognition, the exhaustion of constant responsibility. These are not the experiences of an emperor. They are the experiences of a human being, and every human being who reads them recognizes them immediately across 2,000 years, across every difference of circumstance and culture and time. That recognition, the recognition that you are not alone in what you feel, that the interior of a human life has a consistent shape regardless of its exterior conditions, is itself a form of medicine. Not cure, medicine. Something that makes the bearing of difficulty slightly more possible. Something that takes the edge off the loneliness without pretending the loneliness is not real. In his last years, as he knew his body was failing, as Commodus prepared to take the throne, as the empire he had spent his life serving began its long decline, Marcus wrote some of his most severe and most honest passages. He wrote about death, not with fear, but with the particular attention of a person who has genuinely accepted that it is coming and is trying to understand what that acceptance requires. He wrote about the shortness of a life relative to the span of time it exists within. He wrote about the people who came before him, Emperors, philosophers, generals, ordinary citizens, all of them gone, most of them forgotten. And what that means for the urgency with which a person should pursue reputation or status or the approval of others. He wrote, how many Alexanders, how many Caesars, how many Caesars, how many whole civilizations have come and gone? And then, what does it mean, therefore, that you have been given this day? This day, not the career, not the legacy, not the reputation you are building or the version of yourself you are trying to project or protect. This day, the actual hours you are currently inside, the morning that will arrive tomorrow before everything begins, the 5 quiet minutes before the noise starts, the quality of attention you bring to a conversation with someone you love, the small choices repeated daily that constitute a character over time. This is not small comfort. This is the thing Marcus is pointing to across 2,000 years of silence through a private journal that was never meant to be read by anyone that survived by accident or luck or providence, that reached your hands at this specific moment in your specific life. He is pointing to the territory where everything that actually matters actually lives, not in the outcomes you cannot control, in the quality of presence you bring to each day you are given. The practice, revisited one more time. Tomorrow morning, before anything else. 5 minutes. Sit with the question, what difficulties am I likely to encounter today? And who do I want to be when I meet them? Not what do I want to happen? What do I want to be? Not the event, the response. Not the outcome, the quality of attention. Not the performance, the actual person showing up in the actual moment. Do this for 7 days. Not as a program. Not as a commitment to a new system, just for 7 days, as an experiment in the Aurelian sense, an empirical test of whether what the man was onto corresponds to something real in your own experience. You do not have to believe it ahead of time. You do not have to find it inspiring. Just try it, the way a scientist tries something, and pay attention to what you find, what you will likely find. What people who have engaged with this practice seriously tend to find is not that the difficulties become smaller. It is that your relationship to them changes. The moment of friction still arrives. The conversation still goes sideways. The fear still shows up at 3 in the morning. But there is something you can find your way back to, a quality of settled intention that was not there before, a version of yourself that already decided in the calm of the morning that this moment would not define you, that you would feel what you feel, and then choose what you do. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE in a military camp on the Danube frontier, still at his post, still governing, still fighting the same wars he had been fighting for most of his reign. He did not die in a palace surrounded by luxury. He died the way he had lived, in the middle of it, still showing up, still trying. He was 58 years old. By any reasonable account, he had earned rest. He had earned withdrawal. He had earned the right to let someone else carry the weight for a while. He did not take it, not because he was performing duty or seeking martyrdom, but because he understood something about what it means to be a person in the world. That the practice does not happen in the comfortable spaces. It happens here, in the inconvenient moments, in the places where it would be very easy to stop trying and no one would entirely blame you. In the middle of a difficulty you did not choose and cannot resolve, and must live inside anyway. He wrote, near the end, almost nothing material is needed for a happy life, for a person who has understood a few things. A person who has understood a few things. Not someone who has achieved enlightenment, not someone who has solved the problem of being human, just someone who has understood a few things and is willing to return to them in the small ways, in the daily practice, in the 5 minutes before the day begins. That is the whole teaching. That is what 2,000 years has preserved and brought to this moment, to this conversation, to the specific place you are sitting right now, with whatever you are carrying. And so the question, the one this entire reflection has been building toward, the one that does not have an answer that can be given to you, but only found inside you, is simply this. What is the one thing in your life right now that you have been treating as a fact about your future? when it is actually just a story you have been telling yourself about what is possible, not the difficulty itself. The story around the difficulty, the interpretation you have added, the meaning you have assigned that may not be the only meaning available. Sit with that question honestly, not to perform reflection, not to produce an answer that sounds appropriately thoughtful, but to actually look at the thing you have been circling. The way Marcus looked at the things he was circling, in the private dark, with no audience, with nothing at stake except the quality of your own understanding. That is where everything begins. That is where it has always begun. And you already know that. You have known it for a while. The question is only whether today is the day you decide to take it seriously.